10 gleaming black Mercedes Benz sedans lined up outside Grace's Diner, a humble family restaurant where the most expensive item on the menu cost $12. From the lead vehicle, a man in a three-piece Armani suit emerged, his cold gaze sweeping across the weathered interior with its cracked leather booths and faded checkered floors. Sarah Chen, the 28-year-old waitress wiping down tables, froze as she recognized that face. At the same moment, the door chime rang, and 82-year-old Eleanor Carter shuffled in for her usual lunch, the free meal Sarah had quietly provided for 3 years. The man in the expensive suit turned to look at the elderly woman, and his icy expression shifted into something Sarah had never seen before. Could one act of daily kindness change everything? The morning rush at Grace's Diner moved with the familiar rhythm of working-class Chicago. Coffee refills before the cup hit empty, orders shouted over sizzling bacon, and the gentle clink of mismatched plates stacked high in tired hands. Sarah Chen had learned this dance 3 years ago when desperation led her to the help wanted sign taped crookedly in the window. Now, at 28, she moved through the cramped space between booths with the efficiency of someone who understood that every tip mattered. Every smile could mean the difference between paying rent or choosing between electricity and groceries. The early shift meant she could work a second job in the afternoons, sending money home to her mother's medical bills while slowly, painfully saving toward a dream that felt as distant as the gleaming skyscrapers visible through the diner's smudged windows. If you're watching this story unfold, drop a comment and let us know where you're tuning in from. Every voice matters in ways you might never expect. The regulars knew her name, trusted her with their black coffee and their small talk about weather and disappointments, but Sarah remained essentially invisible. Just another hard-working face in a city full of them. The lunch crowd thinned to its usual handful of retirees nursing coffee when Eleanor Carter made her daily appearance. The woman carried herself with the ghost of elegance, shoulders straight despite her years, silver hair pinned in a neat chignon that spoke of better times, clothes that were clean and pressed but showed their age in faded colors and careful mending. She always chose the corner booth by the window, ordered the cheapest item on the menu, a cup of coffee, and made it last for hours while gazing out at the bustling street with eyes that held stories Sarah could only guess at. Something about the woman's quiet dignity, the way she counted coins from a small worn purse, the careful way she rationed her single coffee, struck a chord deep in Sarah's heart. Without announcing her intentions to anyone, not even herself, Sarah began bringing Eleanor small plates of food, leftover pie, soup that was supposedly going to be thrown out, sandwiches she claimed were made incorrectly. The unspoken understanding between them grew over weeks and months. Eleanor would accept these gifts with gracious thanks, and Sarah would never acknowledge the financial sacrifice these free meals represented. Their conversations started slowly, tentatively, the way relationships bloom between people who understand loneliness. Eleanor spoke in measured tones about a past that remained deliberately vague, a successful son who lived somewhere distant, a husband who had built something significant before his death, choices that had led her to this quiet corner of the world where $20 had to stretch until the next Social Security check arrived. Sarah found herself sharing more than she intended. Stories of her family's immigration from Taiwan, her parents' sacrifices, her father's injury that had ended his construction career, her mother's diabetes that required expensive medications. They discovered common ground in their understanding of pride and necessity, the way dignity could be preserved even when circumstances demanded compromise. Eleanor's eyes, sharp and kind behind wire-rimmed glasses, seemed to see through Sarah's cheerful waitress persona to the intelligent, ambitious woman underneath who dreamed of opening her own restaurant someday. A place that would serve good food to working families without the pretension or prices that kept real community out. 3 years passed in this gentle rhythm of daily care disguised as coincidence. Sarah's small acts of kindness became routine, bringing Eleanor a warm meal when the weather turned cold, offering to drive her home when her arthritis flared, sitting for a few minutes during slow periods to listen to stories about gardens Eleanor had once tended and books she had loved. The elderly woman became a bright spot in Sarah's demanding schedule, Proof that goodness existed without expectation of reward, that family could be chosen as well as born. Eleanor seemed to bloom under this attention, her posture a little straighter, her smiles more frequent, as if having someone who genuinely cared about her well-being had restored something essential that had been slowly withering away. Neither woman spoke about the future or made promises about forever. They simply showed up for each other, day after day, creating a bond that felt as natural and necessary as breathing. But on this particular Tuesday, as Sarah wiped down the last table and prepared for the lunch shift, she had no idea that their quiet world was about to be shattered by 10 Mercedes Benz sedans and a man whose presence would change everything. The black sedans appeared like something from a different universe, their polished surfaces reflecting the neon diner sign in fractured rainbows of light. Conversation stopped mid-sentence as customers and staff alike turned to stare at the motorcade that had somehow found its way to this forgotten corner of Chicago's South Side. From the lead vehicle, a man emerged with the precise movements of someone accustomed to command. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Sarah made in 6 months. His face was angular, handsome in the way of magazine covers, but his eyes held a coldness that seemed to freeze the very air around him. Ethan Carter, though Sarah didn't yet know his name, surveyed the diner's interior with the clinical assessment of someone evaluating an acquisition, his gaze taking in every detail from the duct-taped vinyl seats to the hand-lettered specials board. When those steel-gray eyes finally found Sarah behind the counter, she felt exposed, as if he could read every secret she'd ever kept, every dream she'd dared to harbor. The silence stretched until the door chime announced Eleanor's arrival, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Eleanor Carter stood frozen in the doorway, her face cycling through emotions too complex to untangle: shock, fear, longing, and something that might have been grief. The man in the expensive suit turned at the sound, and for a heartbeat that lasted an eternity, mother and son stared at each other across 15 years of silence and stubborn pride. "Hello, Mother," Ethan said, his voice carrying the cultured tones of boardrooms and country clubs, each word precisely enunciated and utterly devoid of warmth. Eleanor's hands trembled as she gripped her worn leather purse, but her voice remained steady when she replied, "Ethan, I wasn't expecting you." The understatement hung in the air like smoke, while Sarah felt the ground shifting beneath her feet as the pieces of Eleanor's carefully guarded past suddenly clicked into place. The elegant bearing, the way she spoke about literature and art, the distant son who had found success. This was no ordinary elderly woman surviving on Social Security, but the mother of someone whose name appeared on buildings throughout the city. The realization hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had been caring for Eleanor Carter, matriarch of one of Chicago's most prominent business dynasties, and she had never known. The confrontation that followed felt like watching a play performed in a language Sarah only half understood. Ethan's words were carefully controlled, professional even, as he spoke about arrangements he had made: a private suite in the city's most exclusive assisted living facility, a team of caregivers, medical specialists who would monitor Eleanor's health around the clock. But beneath the polite concern, Sarah could hear something harder, a demand wrapped in the language of filial duty. Eleanor listened with the patience of someone who had expected this moment, her responses equally measured, equally polite, and absolutely immovable. "I'm quite comfortable where I am. Thank you," she said, with the kind of quiet authority that had probably run charity boards and social committees in another lifetime. "This is my home now. These people are my family." Her eyes found Sarah across the room, and the younger woman felt the weight of being claimed, of mattering to someone in a way that had nothing to do with efficiency or service. The tension between mother and son grew thicker with each exchange, years of hurt and misunderstanding compressed into carefully neutral phrases that fooled no one. It was then that Ethan truly noticed Sarah, his attention shifting from his mother to the young woman who had been watching this family drama unfold with obvious concern. "You're the one," he said. Not a question, but a statement delivered with the authority of someone accustomed to having access to any information he desired. "You're the one who's been taking care of her." Sarah nodded, unsure whether this was an accusation or an acknowledgement, her heart hammering as she realized that somehow this powerful stranger knew about her secret kindnesses. The look he gave her was complex. Gratitude mixed with suspicion, respect tangled with wariness. "How much?" he asked suddenly, his hand moving toward what was undoubtedly an expensive wallet, and Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger. The assumption that her care could be reduced to a financial transaction, that 3 years of genuine affection and daily attention was nothing more than an elaborate con game, hit her like a slap. "It's not about money," she said, her voice rising despite her efforts to remain calm, and something in Ethan's expression shifted, as if he had never considered that someone might act without expecting payment. The moment stretched taut between them, loaded with implications neither fully understood. Ethan Carter, who had spent 15 years building walls against anyone who might want to use his family's wealth, found himself confronting a young woman who seemed genuinely offended by the suggestion that money had motivated her kindness. Sarah Chen, who had spent 3 years creating a safe space for a lonely, elderly woman, suddenly found herself thrust into the spotlight of scrutiny from someone who could probably buy and sell her entire world without blinking. Eleanor watched this exchange with growing alarm, sensing that the fragile peace she had built was about to crumble under the weight of her son's protective instincts and her chosen daughter's fierce independence. The air in the diner felt charged, electric, as if a storm was building just beyond the horizon. And then Eleanor swayed on her feet, her face going pale, and both Sarah and Ethan lunged forward simultaneously, their conflict forgotten in the face of immediate crisis. In that instant, as they caught her between them, something shifted in the careful balance of power, setting in motion events that would change all their lives forever. The emergency room at Northwestern Memorial Hospital buzzed with the controlled chaos of urban healthcare, monitors beeping, phones ringing, the soft-souled shuffle of nurses moving between curtained alcoves where human dramas played out under fluorescent lights. Sarah sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair beside Eleanor's bed, her waitress uniform feeling out of place among the sterile whites and clinical blues of the medical environment. Across the narrow space, Ethan Carter paced with the restless energy of someone unaccustomed to powerlessness, his expensive suit wrinkled from hours of waiting, his usually perfect hair disheveled from running anxious fingers through it. The doctor had assured them that Eleanor's episode was minor, dehydration combined with the stress of unexpected confrontation, but the forced proximity had created an intimacy none of them had been prepared for. In the quiet hours between medical checks, with Eleanor dozing fitfully under thin hospital blankets, Sarah and Ethan found themselves talking in hushed tones, their earlier antagonism softened by shared concern. For the first time, Sarah saw past the intimidating facade to the son who had been searching for his mother for 15 years, hiring private investigators and monitoring hospital records, desperate for contact but too proud to make the first move. Ethan's story emerged in fragments, like pieces of a puzzle that had been scattered and was slowly being reassembled. His father had died when Ethan was barely 20, leaving behind a struggling construction company and a widow who seemed lost without her husband's guidance and strength. Within a year, Eleanor had remarried, a charming man named David Sinclair who spoke persuasively about business opportunities and treated young Ethan with just enough kindness to seem genuine. It took 3 years for the truth to emerge. Sinclair was systematically draining the company's assets, selling off properties and equipment while convincing Eleanor that the losses were due to market conditions and her son's inexperience. When Ethan finally gathered enough evidence to expose the theft, the confrontation had been devastating. Accusations flying, lawyers called, and Eleanor caught in the middle, believing that her son's jealousy was driving him to destroy her second chance at happiness. The legal battle that followed lasted 2 years and left the family fortune intact, but the family itself shattered beyond repair. "She chose him," Ethan said quietly, his voice still carrying the pain of that ancient betrayal. "Even after we proved what he was, she chose to believe his version of events. She left with him, and I haven't seen her since." Sarah listened with growing understanding, seeing how a son's protective love had been twisted into something that looked like cruelty, how a mother's trust had been weaponized against her own child. But there were gaps in the story, pieces that didn't quite fit with the woman Sarah had come to know. Eleanor, even in her reduced circumstances, carried herself with dignity and wisdom that didn't align with the picture of someone who could be so easily deceived. As if sensing Sarah's confusion, Ethan continued, his voice growing softer, more vulnerable. "I found out later that she knew. Maybe not at first, but before the end, she knew what Sinclair was. She stayed because she felt guilty about the whole mess, like it was her fault for being lonely enough to fall for his lies. She thought leaving was the only way to protect what was left of the company, to keep me from having to choose between saving the business and saving her." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Eleanor hadn't been a foolish old woman led astray by a charming con man, but a mother who had sacrificed her relationship with her son to preserve his inheritance and future. The nobility of it was heartbreaking, and suddenly Sarah understood the sadness she had sometimes glimpsed in Eleanor's eyes, the way she spoke about her son with pride tinged by regret. "She's been protecting you all this time," Sarah said, and watched Ethan's carefully controlled composure finally crack. Years of anger and misunderstanding dissolving into grief for all the time they had lost. The conversation that followed felt like a bridge being built between two people who had been speaking different languages for so long they had forgotten they were trying to communicate the same truths. Sarah found herself defending Eleanor's choices while helping Ethan understand his mother's perspective, serving as translator between two people who loved each other but had been separated by pride and misunderstanding. She spoke about the woman she had come to know, generous despite her poverty, interested in others despite her own struggles, dignified even when accepting charity she couldn't afford to refuse. "She talks about you all the time," Sarah said, watching Ethan's face. "She's so proud of what you've built, so grateful that you found your way even after everything that happened. She keeps newspaper clippings about your company in her purse." The admission seemed to physically pain him, this evidence that his mother had been following his life from a distance, loving him even while staying away to preserve the space she thought he needed. In return, he shared details about the empire he had built, not just the financial success, but the jobs created, the communities served, the foundation that quietly funded programs for at-risk youth and elderly services throughout the city. Sarah began to see that his success hadn't been motivated by greed or power, but by a desire to honor his father's memory and protect the kind of vulnerable people his mother had become. When Eleanor finally woke, the sun was setting outside the hospital window, casting long shadows across the linoleum floor. She looked smaller in the hospital bed, frailer, but her eyes were alert and aware as they moved between her son and the young woman who had become her anchor in a world that had grown increasingly lonely. "I'm sorry," she said, the words directed at both of them, but meant for the years of separation. The misunderstandings that had kept them apart, the pride that had prevented any of them from reaching out sooner. Ethan moved to take her hand, his own trembling slightly as he bridged the physical distance that had seemed insurmountable just hours before. "I'm the one who should apologize," he said. "I should have found you sooner. I should have tried harder to understand." Sarah watched this reunion with tears she couldn't quite explain, understanding that she had been witness to something profound, not just the healing of a family, but the moment when love proved stronger than pride. As mother and son talked quietly, beginning the long process of rebuilding what had been broken, Sarah began to understand that her role in this story was far from over. The connections that had been forged in a humble diner and tested in a sterile hospital room were just the beginning of something that would challenge everything she thought she knew about love, family, and the courage required to let people matter. The penthouse apartment overlooking Lake Michigan was a monument to success and solitude. Floor-to-ceiling windows, framing views that most people saw only in magazines, furniture that belonged in design museums, art that represented more than Sarah's annual income hanging casually on walls painted in shades of dove gray and cream. Eleanor moved through the space with obvious discomfort, her worn cardigan and practical shoes seeming out of place among the sleek surfaces and carefully curated beauty. Within 3 days of her release from the hospital, she had made it clear that luxury could not substitute for community, asking Ethan to drive her to Grace's diner each morning so she could maintain her routine with Sarah. What began as filial duty, Ethan ensuring his mother's safety and happiness, gradually became something more complicated as he found excuses to linger, ordering coffee he didn't want and studying the dynamics of a world he had never experienced. The diner represented everything foreign to his existence. Genuine warmth without agenda. Relationships built on shared experience rather than mutual benefit. A place where wealth meant nothing and character meant everything. Sarah watched his growing fascination with a mixture of amusement and wariness, unsure whether his interest was anthropological curiosity or something deeper. Their first real conversation away from Eleanor's protective presence happened during the dinner rush on a Thursday evening when a late meeting had delayed Ethan's arrival to collect his mother. Sarah was moving between tables with practiced efficiency, balancing plates and fielding requests while keeping one eye on Eleanor, who sat in her usual booth reading a paperback novel and occasionally looking toward the door. When Ethan finally appeared, still wearing his business suit but with his tie loosened and his hair slightly mussed from what had obviously been a difficult day, he looked around the crowded diner with something approaching wonder. "It's different in the evening," he said when Sarah approached his table, coffee pot in hand. "More alive somehow." She followed his gaze, seeing the familiar scene through his eyes. Families sharing inexpensive meals, elderly couples dividing pieces of pie, teenagers counting their money to make sure they had enough for burgers and sodas. "This is real life," she said, filling his cup without being asked. "Not everyone gets to live in glass towers." The comment could have been insulting, but something in her tone made it sound like an invitation instead, a suggestion that perhaps he might want to understand this world better. What followed was an education unlike any Ethan had ever received. Sarah, perhaps sensing his genuine curiosity, began explaining the unspoken rules and rhythms of working-class life. How tips weren't just extra money but essential income. How regulars became family because everyone needed somewhere to belong. How small kindnesses could make the difference between despair and hope. She pointed out the subtle signs of struggle and resilience. The businessman who ordered only coffee because he was between jobs. The elderly woman who made a sandwich last an hour because it was her main meal of the day. The teenage girl who studied at a corner table because home wasn't safe for homework. Ethan listened with the intensity he usually reserved for board meetings, asking questions that revealed both his ignorance and his desire to understand. "How do you do it?" he asked finally. "How do you stay kind when you see so much need you can't fix?" Sarah considered the question seriously, recognizing that he wasn't asking about technique, but about philosophy. "You do what you can for the person in front of you," she said. "You can't save everyone, but you can save someone, and maybe that's enough." The simplicity of it seemed to stun him, this idea that meaning could be found in small acts rather than grand gestures. The evening stretched longer than either had planned, Eleanor content with her book while Sarah worked and Ethan observed, occasionally helping without being asked, clearing tables, refilling water glasses, learning the names of regulars and their stories. As the crowd thinned toward closing time, Sarah found herself teaching him to work the ancient coffee machine, their hands accidentally brushing as she guided him through the process of creating the perfect cup. The touch was electric, unexpected, and both pulled back with the awareness that something was shifting between them. Some boundary was being crossed. "Why are you really here?" Sarah asked as they stood side by side behind the counter, the question emerging from her growing certainty that his presence had nothing to do with Eleanor's transportation needs. Ethan was quiet for a long moment, his hands wrapped around the coffee mug she had taught him to fill, his eyes focused on the dark liquid, as if it held answers he was afraid to speak aloud. "Because I've never met anyone like you," he said finally. "Because you took care of my mother when I couldn't, and you didn't want anything in return, and I don't understand how that's possible." The honesty of it hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. Eleanor, watching from her booth with the satisfaction of someone whose plans were unfolding exactly as hoped, closed her book, and announced that she was ready to go home. The ride back to Ethan's penthouse was quiet. All three passengers lost in their own thoughts about the evening's revelations and the possibilities they had uncovered. But as Eleanor prepared for bed in the guest suite, Ethan had transformed into a space worthy of her dignity. She took her son's hand and spoke with the authority of someone who had lived long enough to recognize rare opportunities when they appeared. "That young woman saved my life in ways you don't understand yet," she said. "She gave me purpose when I had none, family when I was alone, hope when everything seemed dark. She's special, Ethan, in ways that have nothing to do with what she does for a living or where she comes from. Don't let pride or fear make you waste what could be the best thing that ever happened to you." As Ethan stood alone in his minimalist living room later that night, staring out at the city lights that sparkled like earthbound stars, he found himself thinking not about quarterly reports or acquisition strategies, but about the warmth in Sarah's eyes when she looked at his mother, the grace with which she moved through her world, and the possibility that maybe, just maybe, he had found something worth more than all the success he had spent his adult life pursuing. Spring in Chicago arrived with the tentative hope of daffodils pushing through still frozen ground, and with it came a routine that none of them had planned, but all had grown to cherish. Ethan's morning visits to Grace's diner had evolved from duty into necessity, his expensive suits gradually giving way to more casual attire as he learned to navigate a world where authenticity mattered more than appearance. He had become a student of Sarah's universe, watching her work with the focused attention he had once reserved for market analyses, learning the names of regulars and the stories that connected them all in an invisible web of shared humanity. Sarah, initially suspicious of his motives, had begun to appreciate his genuine interest in understanding her life, the way he listened without judgment and asked questions that revealed a mind capable of growth and change. Between them, Eleanor served as both bridge and catalyst, her obvious delight in their growing friendship giving both permission to explore the attraction that hummed beneath their surface interactions like a current too strong to ignore but too dangerous to touch directly. Their first real date happened almost by accident, born from Eleanor's sudden announcement that she planned to spend the afternoon at the library and wouldn't need transportation home. Sarah had just finished her shift, trading her apron for a light jacket as Ethan arrived to find his mother already gone and his evening unexpectedly free. "Have dinner with me," he said, the invitation emerging without the careful planning that usually preceded his social interactions. "Not somewhere fancy," he added quickly, seeing hesitation in her expression. "Somewhere you choose. Show me your Chicago." Sarah studied his face, searching for the condescension or pity that had colored so many interactions with people from his world, but finding only genuine interest and something that looked dangerously like hope. "Okay," she said, surprising herself with the decision. "But you're going to need different shoes." An hour later, they were walking through Chinatown, Sarah guiding him past tourist destinations toward the hole-in-the-wall restaurant where her family had celebrated every important milestone of her childhood. The elderly owner greeted Sarah in rapid Mandarin, his weathered face creasing into smiles as he ushered them toward a table barely large enough for two people and decorated with plastic flowers that had seen better decades. The meal became a revelation for both of them, Sarah translating not just the menu but the cultural context that made each dish significant, while Ethan shared stories about his travels that revealed a man hungry for authentic experience but trapped by the expectations of his position. They talked about books and movies, about the responsibility of privilege and the dignity of honest work, about dreams deferred and chances taken. Sarah found herself describing her vision for the restaurant she hoped to open someday. Not a trendy destination for food critics, but a neighborhood place where families could afford to celebrate, where good food and genuine warmth would create the kind of community she had found at Grace's diner. Ethan listened with the intensity of someone discovering a new language, his questions revealing both his business acumen and his growing understanding of what truly mattered. "Money isn't the only way to measure success," Sarah said as they shared a dessert that cost less than Ethan usually spent on coffee. "Sometimes it's about how many people you feed, how many stories you hear, how many lives you touch in small but meaningful ways." The philosophy was so different from everything he had been taught about achievement and value that it felt like intellectual whiplash, but also like coming home to a truth he had always known but never allowed himself to acknowledge. As they walked back through the city streets, the distance between their worlds seemed to collapse with each step. Ethan found himself seeing Chicago through Sarah's eyes, not as a collection of business districts and investment opportunities, but as a living organism of interconnected communities where every person mattered, where kindness was currency and relationships were wealth. They paused in Grant Park, finding a bench beside the lake where the city lights reflected on dark water like fallen stars, and Ethan spoke about the loneliness of success, the way wealth had become a wall that kept genuine connection at bay. "Everyone wants something from me," he said, his voice carrying years of accumulated caution. "Business deals, charitable donations, social connections that benefit their agendas. I stopped trusting that anyone could see me as more than a bank account with legs." Sarah understood the pain behind his cynicism, but she also challenged it with a directness that few people in his world would dare. "Maybe you made yourself into what they expected," she said gently. "Maybe you forgot that you're allowed to be human, to need things, to want more than just professional respect." The observation hit him like a physical blow, not because it was cruel, but because it was accurate, a mirror reflecting choices he had made in the name of protection, but which had ultimately become a prison. The kiss that followed was inevitable, electric and gentle all at once. Ethan's careful control meeting Sarah's passionate warmth in a moment that felt like the collision of two different universes creating something entirely new. Under the canopy of stars visible despite the city's glow, they discovered that attraction could transcend circumstances, that understanding could bridge any gap if both people were brave enough to be vulnerable. "This is complicated," Sarah whispered against his lips, acknowledging the thousand reasons why their connection was impractical, impossible, potentially destructive for both of them. "Yes," Ethan agreed, his hand tangling in her dark hair as he memorized the feel of her in his arms. "But maybe complicated doesn't have to mean impossible." They sat together until the city quieted around them, talking about everything and nothing, building a foundation of intimacy that had nothing to do with physical attraction and everything to do with the recognition of kindred spirits who had found each other across an unlikely divide. When he finally drove her home to the modest apartment she shared with two roommates, neither mentioned the obvious differences in their living situations or the challenges that lay ahead. Instead, they made plans for tomorrow, for next week, for a future that felt as fragile and precious as spun glass, but worth fighting for despite all the forces that would try to tear it apart. The invitation arrived on cream-colored cardstock with edges so sharp they could cut skin, engraved lettering announcing the Sinclair Foundation's annual charity gala at the Drake Hotel. Eleanor studied it with the expression of someone recognizing poison disguised as perfume, her fingers trembling slightly as she traced the elegant script that bore a name she had hoped never to encounter again. Margaret Sinclair, David's daughter, the one person who blamed Eleanor for her father's downfall and had spent 15 years nursing her resentment like a flame she refused to let die. "She knows," Eleanor said quietly, showing the invitation to Ethan and Sarah as they shared their usual afternoon coffee at Grace's diner. "She knows about us, about our happiness, and she wants to destroy it." The words carried the weight of prophecy, and all three of them understood that the fragile peace they had built was about to be tested by forces that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with old wounds that had never properly healed. Ethan's jaw tightened as he recognized the careful timing. The gala fell on the same weekend he had planned to take Sarah away for a quiet retreat, their first chance to be together without the protective buffer of public spaces and Eleanor's presence. Margaret Sinclair had aged into the kind of elegance that money could buy and genuine happiness couldn't achieve. Her silver hair styled to perfection, her designer gown fitted to hide the brittleness that had settled into her bones along with years of bitterness. She moved through the Drake's ballroom like a shark scenting blood in the water, air-kissing donors and board members while keeping one eye fixed on the entrance, waiting for her quarry to arrive. When Ethan appeared with Eleanor on one arm and Sarah on the other, Margaret's smile sharpened into something that barely qualified as human expression. She had done her homework thoroughly, hiring private investigators to document Sarah's background, her family's financial struggles, her mother's medical bills that created ongoing pressure no amount of good intentions could relieve. The photographs and financial records spread across Margaret's desk told the story she wanted to believe. A gold digger who had identified a vulnerable elderly woman as her path to a billionaire's fortune, playing a long game that was finally reaching its culmination. The fact that the evidence could be interpreted differently, that genuine kindness might exist without ulterior motive, was not something Margaret's worldview could accommodate. The ballroom itself was a monument to ostentatious charity. Crystal chandeliers casting rainbows on marble floors. Ice sculptures melting slowly beside tables laden with food that cost more than most people spent on groceries in a month. Women draped in jewels discussing poverty programs while wearing enough wealth to fund homeless shelters for years. Sarah felt the weight of every stare, every whispered conversation that died when she passed. Every appraising look that cataloged her off-the-rack dress and department store shoes against the designer creations surrounding her like plumage in an exotic bird sanctuary. Ethan stayed close, his hand on her back providing anchor and protection, but even his presence couldn't shield her from the growing certainty that she was being displayed like a specimen in a zoo exhibit labeled "How the Other Half Lives." Eleanor navigated the social currents with the skill of someone who had once belonged to this world, her natural dignity providing armor against the subtle cuts and calculated slights that were the preferred weapons of polite society warfare. The attack, when it came, was delivered with surgical precision during the evening's main presentation. Margaret took the stage to speak about the Foundation's mission of supporting deserving families in crisis. Her words carefully chosen to sound philanthropic while laying groundwork for character assassination. She spoke about the importance of ensuring that charitable resources went to those with genuine need rather than opportunistic individuals who might manipulate sympathy for personal gain. As she talked, photographs appeared on the massive screens flanking the stage. Images of Sarah serving coffee, of her apartment building, of her mother in a hospital bed, all presented with captions that twisted context into condemnation. "We must be vigilant," Margaret continued, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being believed without question, against those who would exploit the generous hearts of our community's most vulnerable members. The implication was clear, devastating, and calculated to destroy not just Sarah's reputation, but her relationship with both Eleanor and Ethan in one carefully orchestrated blow. The silence that followed felt like the aftermath of an explosion. Every eye in the ballroom focused on their table, while Sarah's face flushed with humiliation and rage. Ethan started to rise, his own fury building toward something that would undoubtedly end in tabloid headlines and boardroom consequences. But Sarah's hand on his arm stopped him. She understood with painful clarity that any defense would only validate Margaret's accusations, that fighting back would be interpreted as confirmation of guilt, that her only choice was to absorb the attack with whatever dignity she could muster. "I need some air," she whispered, standing with movements that felt mechanical, disconnected from the emotional chaos churning inside her chest. As she walked toward the ballroom's exit, she could feel the weight of judgment following her like physical pressure. Hundreds of people convinced they now understood the true nature of her relationship with Eleanor and Ethan. Behind her, she heard Eleanor's voice rising in defense, heard Ethan's sharp words cutting through the murmur of scandal-hungry conversation. But the damage was already done. By morning, the photos would be online, the story would be spreading through social media and gossip columns, and Sarah Chen would be forever labeled as the waitress who had tried to con her way into high society through the kindness of a lonely old woman and her guilty son. The media storm broke like a flash flood, sudden and devastating, transforming Sarah's quiet life into a public spectacle that felt surreal in its cruelty. By dawn, photographers had found her apartment building, camping outside with telephoto lenses, and shouted questions that followed her to work, to the grocery store, to her mother's medical appointments. The headlines wrote themselves with gleeful malice. "Gold digger's long game. Waitress cons billionaire family. The price of false charity." Grace's diner became ground zero for a circus Sarah never asked to join. Reporters ordering coffee they didn't want while fishing for quotes from coworkers and customers who found themselves thrust into a story they barely understood. The elderly regulars who had watched Sarah's daily kindness toward Eleanor suddenly saw their sanctuary invaded by strangers with cameras and accusations. Their quiet refuge transformed into a battlefield where every conversation was potential ammunition for a narrative that cast their friend as a villain in someone else's revenge fantasy. The board meeting at Carter Industries convened with the solemn gravity of a tribunal. 15 powerful individuals gathering in the glass-walled conference room that overlooked the city Ethan had spent his adult life serving through business and philanthropy. Margaret Sinclair sat at the far end of the polished table, her expression a carefully composed mask of concern for the company's reputation and Ethan's personal welfare. The presentation she delivered was masterful in its manipulation. Financial projections showing potential losses from negative publicity, stockholder concerns about leadership judgment, legal vulnerabilities that could arise from association with someone now publicly accused of elder abuse. She spoke about fiduciary responsibility and the need to protect Carter Industries from scandal, her voice never rising above conversational tones while systematically dismantling Ethan's character and choices. "We all understand the appeal of playing savior," she said, her tone suggesting sympathy while delivering condemnation. But when personal feelings cloud professional judgment to this extent, the board has an obligation to act. The ultimatum was delivered with boardroom efficiency. End the relationship immediately and publicly. Issue a statement distancing the company from Sarah Chen's alleged manipulation, or face a vote of no confidence that would strip him of his CEO position and potentially trigger a hostile takeover that could destroy everything his father had built. The confrontation between Sarah and Ethan happened in the one place that had always felt safe, the back booth at Grace's diner after closing time, surrounded by the familiar smell of coffee and the ghosts of happier conversations. Sarah had been dreading this moment since the scandal broke, knowing that no amount of love could overcome the practical realities of Ethan's position and responsibilities. She watched him struggle with words that wouldn't come, seeing the conflict written across his features as clearly as if he had spoken his thoughts aloud. "You have to choose them," she said finally, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill over. "You have to choose the company, the board, your future. I understand." But Ethan shook his head, reaching for her hands across the scarred formica table where they had shared so many meals and conversations. "I don't care about any of that," he said, his voice carrying a desperation that made her heart break even more completely. "I care about you, about us, about building something real together." The declaration should have brought joy, but instead it crystallized Sarah's understanding of just how impossible their situation had become. The argument that followed was born from love disguised as practicality, each of them trying to protect the other while simultaneously destroying what they had built together. Sarah spoke about his obligations to thousands of employees, about the foundation that funded programs helping people like her own family, about the responsibility that came with inherited wealth and power. Ethan countered with arguments about choosing happiness over expectation, about refusing to let bullies like Margaret Sinclair dictate the terms of his personal life, about the possibility that love might be worth any sacrifice. But beneath their words lay the deeper truth that both recognized but neither wanted to acknowledge. The world they lived in wouldn't allow their relationship to survive intact, that the forces arrayed against them had resources and patience that would outlast any romantic idealism. "I won't be the reason you lose everything your father built," Sarah said finally, the words emerging from a place of love so deep it felt like drowning. "I won't be responsible for destroying the good you can do in this world because Margaret Sinclair wants revenge for something that happened before I was born." The nobility of her sacrifice made it no less devastating for either of them. The goodbye happened over several days, a slow dissolution rather than a clean break, as if neither could quite accept that their story was ending. Eleanor tried to mediate, to find some compromise that would preserve both the relationship and Ethan's position. But even her wisdom couldn't overcome the structural inequalities that made their love story impossible in any world that valued money over meaning. Sarah made her decision with the same quiet strength she had shown throughout their relationship, choosing to leave Chicago rather than remain as a constant reminder of what couldn't be. She packed her few belongings with methodical precision, said goodbye to coworkers who had become family, and visited Eleanor one final time in the penthouse apartment that still felt like a museum rather than a home. The elderly woman pressed a small leather journal into Sarah's hands. 3 years of daily observations, gratitude, and love written in elegant script that documented every kindness, every moment of joy, every instance of healing that Sarah's presence had brought to a life that had been slowly dying from loneliness. "You saved me," Eleanor whispered, holding Sarah close with arms that trembled from age and emotion. "You gave me back my son, my hope, my faith in human goodness. No one can take that away, no matter what lies they tell about your motives." They both wept then, for the family they had created and were now forced to abandon, for the love that had bloomed between Sarah and Ethan and was being sacrificed to preserve something larger than their individual happiness. As Sarah walked away from the building for the final time, she carried with her not bitterness but gratitude for having experienced a love pure enough to require this level of sacrifice. Portland's food truck scene buzzed with the diverse energy of a city that celebrated creativity over convention, where success was measured not by square footage or profit margins, but by the length of lines and the genuine smiles of satisfied customers. Sarah had found work with Rose's Kitchen, a family-owned truck that served authentic Mexican food to construction workers and office employees who valued quality over ambiance, community over commerce. The rhythm of her new life was familiar yet different. The same skills, the same dedication to service, but in a context that felt lighter somehow, free from the weight of hidden pain and complicated loyalties. She had taken a small apartment in southeast Portland, sharing space with a nursing student named Katie, whose shifts at the hospital matched Sarah's unusual hours, creating a friendship built on mutual respect for hard work and simple dreams. In quiet moments, usually late at night when exhaustion should have guaranteed immediate sleep, Sarah would read Eleanor's journal, tracing the elegant handwriting that chronicled 3 years of observed kindness and growing affection, finding comfort in the proof that their relationship had been real and meaningful regardless of how the world chose to interpret it. The news reached her through the impersonal medium of a CNN alert on her phone, the kind of breaking story that flashed across millions of screens before disappearing into the endless churn of information overload. Carter Industries CEO resigns, announces new philanthropic venture, the headline read, followed by a brief article that mentioned Ethan's plans to liquidate his personal holdings to fund a chain of community kitchens serving working families throughout the Midwest. Sarah's hands trembled as she read the sparse details, understanding that he had chosen a path she never could have asked him to take, but which aligned perfectly with the conversations they had shared about meaningful success and the responsibility that came with privilege. The first location, already under construction in Chicago's South Side, would bear the name Eleanor's Kitchen, a memorial to community service and the kind of love that expressed itself through daily acts of kindness rather than grand gestures. The article mentioned Sarah only in passing, noting that the inspiration for the venture had come from observing the impact of authentic community care, but she recognized the careful language as both protection and acknowledgement, Ethan's way of honoring their relationship without exposing her to further scrutiny. 6 months after leaving Chicago, Sarah received the phone call that changed everything again. Eleanor's voice was weaker than Sarah remembered, carrying the tremor of age and illness that couldn't be hidden by careful words and deliberate optimism. "I'm dying, dear one," the elderly woman said without preamble, her directness born from a lifetime of facing difficult truths with dignity intact. "Not immediately, not dramatically, but soon enough that I want to see you again, to say goodbye properly, to make sure you know how much our friendship has meant to me." The request was simple, impossible to refuse, and terrifying in its implications. Returning to Chicago meant risking encounter with Ethan, confronting the life she had walked away from, opening wounds that had barely begun to heal. But Eleanor had given her 3 years of family when she had none, had provided the foundation for a love story that had transformed all their lives, had earned the right to ask for this final gift. Sarah requested emergency leave from work, used the last of her savings for a plane ticket, and found herself once again walking through the automatic doors of Northwestern Memorial Hospital, her heart hammering with memories and anticipation. Eleanor looked smaller in the hospital bed, diminished by illness, but still radiating the quiet dignity that had first drawn Sarah's attention years ago in Grace's diner. Her eyes brightened when Sarah entered the room, a smile transforming her face in ways that made the journey worthwhile, regardless of what other consequences might follow. They talked for hours about everything and nothing. Portland's food scene, Eleanor's memories of Chicago in younger days, the novel she was reading despite weakening eyesight, the flowers Ethan brought every day and arranged with surprising skill for someone who had never learned to care for living things. "He asks about you," Eleanor said as afternoon light slanted through the hospital windows. "Not directly, not in ways that demand answers, but I can see the questions in his eyes every time someone mentions your name." Sarah felt the familiar ache of missing him, of loving someone she couldn't have, but also the deeper satisfaction of knowing that their connection had been real enough to endure separation and strong enough to survive the attempts to destroy it. "He's different now," Eleanor continued, her voice growing softer as medication began to take effect. "Happier, somehow. Despite everything that's happened, he's found purpose beyond profit, meaning beyond just success. You changed him, Sarah, in ways that will ripple outward for the rest of his life." The reunion happened at Eleanor's bedside, inevitable and overwhelming, as if the universe had decided that some connections transcended circumstances and refused to be severed by anything as simple as geographic distance or social pressure. Ethan appeared in the doorway with arms full of fresh flowers and a face that cycled through shock, joy, and something deeper that Sarah recognized as the same mixture of hope and terror she felt in her own chest. They stared at each other across the space of months and misunderstanding while Eleanor watched with the satisfaction of someone whose final plans were unfolding exactly as intended. "I called you both here," she admitted without apology, "because life is too short for pride and too precious for wasting on other people's opinions about who deserves to be loved." The words hung in the air like a challenge and a blessing. Permission to reclaim what they had lost and wisdom hard-earned through decades of choosing duty over happiness. Eleanor died 3 days later, peacefully in her sleep with both of them holding her hands. Her final gift to them, the proof that love could survive any test if the people involved were brave enough to fight for it. At her funeral, Sarah and Ethan stood together in the cemetery where Eleanor would rest beside her first husband. And as dirt fell on polished wood, they made promises to each other and to her memory about building something lasting from the foundation she had given them. The love story that had begun with free meals and daily kindness would continue, tested by fire, but tempered into something strong enough to withstand any storm that money or malice could create. The epilogue to their story was written not in headlines or board resolutions, but in the quiet satisfactions of shared purpose and daily choice. Sarah returned to Chicago not as Ethan's girlfriend or Eleanor's charity case, but as the operations director for Eleanor's kitchen, bringing her experience and passion to a project that honored their shared commitment to community service and authentic connection. They built their relationship on the foundation Eleanor had provided: respect, understanding, and the recognition that love worth having was love worth fighting for, regardless of what the world thought about their different backgrounds or unconventional beginning. Margaret Sinclair found herself increasingly isolated as the board of Carter Industries recognized that Ethan's new direction had actually strengthened the company's reputation and market position. Her attempts at revenge ultimately backfiring into irrelevance and early retirement. And in the original Grace's Diner, now preserved as the flagship location of a growing network of community kitchens, a small plaque near Eleanor's favorite booth bore a simple inscription: "In memory of Eleanor Carter, who proved that the smallest acts of kindness can change the world." For those watching this story unfold, remember that love comes in many forms, but the most powerful is the kind that sees beyond circumstances to the heart of who we really are, and chooses to nurture that goodness regardless of cost or consequence. Carter Industries CEO resigns, announces new philanthropic venture, the headline read, followed by a brief article that mentioned Ethan's plans to liquidate his personal holdings to fund a chain of community kitchens serving working families throughout the Midwest. Sarah's hands trembled as she read the sparse details, understanding that he had chosen a path she never could have asked him to take, but which aligned perfectly with the conversations they had shared about meaningful success and the responsibility that came with privilege. The first location, already under construction in Chicago's South Side, would bear the name Eleanor's Kitchen, a memorial to community service and the kind of love that expressed itself through daily acts of kindness rather than grand gestures. The article mentioned Sarah only in passing, noting that the inspiration for the venture had come from observing the impact of authentic community care, but she recognized the careful language as both protection and acknowledgement, Ethan's way of honoring their relationship without exposing her to further scrutiny. 6 months after leaving Chicago, Sarah received the phone call that changed everything again. Eleanor's voice was weaker than Sarah remembered, carrying the tremor of age and illness that couldn't be hidden by careful words and deliberate optimism. "I'm dying, dear one," the elderly woman said without preamble, her directness born from a lifetime of facing difficult truths with dignity intact. "Not immediately, not dramatically, but soon enough that I want to see you again, to say goodbye properly, to make sure you know how much our friendship has meant to me." The request was simple, impossible to refuse, and terrifying in its implications. Returning to Chicago meant risking encounter with Ethan, confronting the life she had walked away from, opening wounds that had barely begun to heal. But Eleanor had given her 3 years of family when she had none, had provided the foundation for a love story that had transformed all their lives, had earned the right to ask for this final gift. Sarah requested emergency leave from work, used the last of her savings for a plane ticket, and found herself once again walking through the automatic doors of Northwestern Memorial Hospital, her heart hammering with memories and anticipation. Eleanor looked smaller in the hospital bed, diminished by illness but still radiating the quiet dignity that had first drawn Sarah's attention years ago in Grace's diner. Her eyes brightened when Sarah entered the room, a smile transforming her face in ways that made the journey worthwhile, regardless of what other consequences might follow. They talked for hours about everything and nothing. Portland's food scene, Eleanor's memories of Chicago in younger days, the novel she was reading despite weakening eyesight, the flowers Ethan brought every day and arranged with surprising skill for someone who had never learned to care for living things. "He asks about you," Eleanor said as afternoon light slanted through the hospital windows. "Not directly, not in ways that demand answers, but I can see the questions in his eyes every time someone mentions your name." Sarah felt the familiar ache of missing him, of loving someone she couldn't have, but also the deeper satisfaction of knowing that their connection had been real enough to endure separation and strong enough to survive the attempts to destroy it. "He's different now," Eleanor continued, her voice growing softer as medication began to take effect. "Happier, somehow. Despite everything that's happened, he's found purpose beyond profit, meaning beyond just success. You changed him, Sarah, in ways that will ripple outward for the rest of his life." The reunion happened at Eleanor's bedside, inevitable and overwhelming, as if the universe had decided that some connections transcended circumstances and refused to be severed by anything as simple as geographic distance or social pressure. Ethan appeared in the doorway with arms full of fresh flowers and a face that cycled through shock, joy, and something deeper that Sarah recognized as the same mixture of hope and terror she felt in her own chest. They stared at each other across the space of months and misunderstanding while Eleanor watched with the satisfaction of someone whose final plans were unfolding exactly as intended. "I called you both here," she admitted without apology, "because life is too short for pride and too precious for wasting on other people's opinions about who deserves to be loved." The words hung in the air like a challenge and a blessing. Permission to reclaim what they had lost and wisdom hard-earned through decades of choosing duty over happiness. Eleanor died 3 days later, peacefully in her sleep with both of them holding her hands. Her final gift to them, the proof that love could survive any test if the people involved were brave enough to fight for it. At her funeral, Sarah and Ethan stood together in the cemetery where Eleanor would rest beside her first husband. And as dirt fell on polished wood, they made promises to each other and to her memory about building something lasting from the foundation she had given them. The love story that had begun with free meals and daily kindness would continue. Tested by fire, but tempered into something strong enough to withstand any storm that money or malice could create. The epilogue to their story was written not in headlines or board resolutions, but in the quiet satisfactions of shared purpose and daily choice. Sarah returned to Chicago not as Ethan's girlfriend or Eleanor's charity case, but as the operations director for Eleanor's kitchen, bringing her experience and passion to a project that honored their shared commitment to community service and authentic connection. They built their relationship on the foundation Eleanor had provided: respect, understanding, and the recognition that love worth having was love worth fighting for, regardless of what the world thought about their different backgrounds or unconventional beginning. Margaret Sinclair found herself increasingly isolated as the board of Carter Industries recognized that Ethan's new direction had actually strengthened the company's reputation and market position. Her attempts at revenge ultimately backfiring into irrelevance and early retirement. And in the original Grace's Diner, now preserved as the flagship location of a growing network of community kitchens, a small plaque near Eleanor's favorite booth bore a simple inscription: "In memory of Eleanor Carter, who proved that the smallest acts of kindness can change the world." For those watching this story unfold, remember that love comes in many forms, but the most powerful is the kind that sees beyond circumstances to the heart of who we really are, and chooses to nurture that goodness regardless of cost or consequence.